You are listening to a podcast about the Brabant Killers. We have in studio the author of a recent book regarding these killings. The book is entitled Insane Killers, Inc., and the author is Charles Maurice. Maybe just to lead off, perhaps could you, for listeners that don't know much about this case, could you just give us a brief overview of what it's all about?
It's the most outrageous unsolved mystery I had ever encountered. It's a case of serial killings which happened in the Brussels area, in Belgium, and in northern France. There were 30 dead and 50 injured over several different shootings.
Who are the Brabant Killers?
3 men, or that's what people believe, that went from one supermarket to the next during the 80s. They would shoot down customers, cashiers, supermarket managers, and leave with really a small amount of cash, which begs the question, what were their motive? And because of the absence of motive, there's been all kind of conspiracy theories behind the murders and why they were not found yet.
And when did this occur again?
It happened over a 3-year period between 1982 and 1985.
And tell me, how did you get interested in this story in the first place?
I heard about what was an incredible unsolved mystery in Europe. It's one of the biggest unsolved mysteries that there are still out there, and it seems to me very complex and multifaceted. It piqued my curiosity. It had international links. It wasn't strictly a European story.
Is Charles Maurice a pseudonym?
Charles Maurice is a pen name. I am in fact a lawyer. I did travel to Europe to complete my research regarding the events, and I looked into the legal cases around them. But to clear up a misconception, I'm not European and I've never lived in Europe.
Why did you write your book first in English?
The original intention was to make a typical true crime style book in English only, and to give all the details and all the conspiracies leading to the CIA, European royalty, or international sex trafficking networks, a bit like the Epstein case. And it was basically to take a serious look at all the various leads, debunking them if necessary. And this was strictly for an English readership. But 2 issues popped up while I was researching and writing the book. First, all the leads that were well known were not created equal. Some were very strong, while some of the more spectacular leads that are discussed extensively on the internet are very weak. And also, a typical true crime book will have dialogues and stylistic effects to make them interesting. But some of the leads were so weak that I couldn't do anything but to give a passing comment on them. So I felt I had no choice but to rewrite it at some point away from a traditional true crime book and more towards a neutral, heavily documented style. The other issue is I find the case is much closer to be solved than I originally believed. The reason is there's been a lot of information which has leaked out from family members of victims because they had access to the case, which is kind of exceptional in this type of legal system. And there's also been several good books in French or Dutch where there's been a lot of interviews of people that were involved, and there were some leaks, deliberate or not. I could bring everything together, and my book was also relevant, I found, to a French and Dutch audience. So I decided to write also a French and a Dutch version, but it was not the original intention. The original intention was strictly to do a book in English.
And what about the title, Insane Killers, Inc.? How did you come to choose such a title?
I came up with the title because I found it described what the story was all about. They had already been called early on the Insane Killers by the Belgian press because they had killed so many people for ridiculous loot, and they would bring overpowering firepower for just simple supermarket robberies. Each guy, for example, would carry 2 weapons, and they would kill people for little or no reason. But the more I got into the story, the more I realized this was more like organized mayhem. They didn't use ultraviolet strictly because they might be mad in real life. It looked like their murders were contrived, the violence was contrived, planned beforehand, and it served a particular purpose for them. So they profited from it. That's where the ink comes from.
One of the many mysteries in this case is just the whole question of a motive of these supermarket killings. A lot of theories have emerged over the years. Can you go through some of those?
The suspected motive has shifted from political terrorism to violent armed robbers and back to terrorism again. At one point, the investigators were divided into two task forces, one taking care of the political leads and the other task force taking care of the gangster-related leads. And the lack of motive has been a problem because serial killing cases where the motive is unclear can be much harder to solve. For example, there was the Unabomber case where investigators during the first years were struggling to find a link between the victims and tie it to a motive. And still today, in the Brabant Killers case, there's confusion as to the motive. Is it armed robbers or political extremists? Why there's this confusion is partly to blame by the fact there were two distinct waves of killings with a 1.5 year pause between them. And the first wave looked much more like traditional gangster activities, whereas the second wave, on first glance, looks like terror because there was no logical link between the massacres and the ridiculously small loots.
Tell me, why should Americans be interested in this case and read about it?
Well, many Americans will be surprised about this, but the story has always been linked to America or Americans at some level since the beginning. And some still believe that the CIA are suspects for the murders. Some of the suspects would have fled to America. Some believe that they were even helped out by the CIA to exfiltrate them and protect them from Belgian justice.
You mentioned there were 3 killers.
The investigators split them in 3 figures: the giant, the old man, and the psycho. Actually, in Belgium and in Europe, they call him the killer. But for ease of purpose and also because I find it describes him well, I prefer the term the psycho in English because as far as I can tell, they're all killers. And what distinguished the psycho from the others is that he was more insane and had more trouble controlling his temper or his impulses. There's been lots of debate. Were there only 3 guys that played the role of the 3 figures? The old man seems to have had a real knack of changing his appearance the most and was probably no older than the 2 others. The giant, as the name suggests, was a head taller than the others, and the name comes from eyewitnesses.
In your opinion, who is the giant?
There could be a decent argument that there were even 2 more because there was a tall guy in some of the earlier crimes of the Brabant Killers. And it was during the period where the investigators hadn't pieced together that all the crimes were linked. The tall guy seemed slim and not as impressive as the one in the later occurrences. And once the gang attained a certain degree of notoriety, it's the witnesses that started noticing this massive, tall bodybuilder type that they called themselves the giant. And it's only retroactively that the tall, slender guy of the earlier crimes was matched to the giant at the end. And even at the end of their crime spree, during their last 2 massacres, the description of the giant were a bit different.
I imagine there was no DNA evidence available at the time, was there?
At the time of the killing, DNA evidence didn't exist. However, when DNA started being available, they started looking at pieces of evidence that were left behind on the crime scenes to find if they could do a DNA profile. The obvious benefit is that during the crime, the killers wouldn't have known that DNA evidence or forensic testing of this type would be available one day. The disadvantage is that investigators themselves, after they had checked for fingerprints, they might have not been careful with the pieces of evidence and could have by accident contaminated them. There was, for example, a DNA profile that was made not too long ago based on cigarette butts. It was during a taxi ride where supposedly the psycho could have been in, or another one of the killers, and he would have left some cigarette butts inside of the taxi. So do we know for sure that the cigarette butts were not from another client, or that they weren't contaminated by someone that handled them later? And finally, the killers could have planted them themselves at some point. They didn't know about DNA, but they sure knew about fingerprints. Just to say, this is not rocket science. The Green River Killer, who had an IQ of 85 when he was tested, planted cigarette butts on crime scenes just to confuse investigators because he didn't smoke himself.
Could you just highlight who were some of the most, speculated suspects in this case?
Like the way that the investigations was split up at some point, you can split the suspects that were looked at in two groups. You have on the one hand criminal gangs, and on the other hand political groups. One of the more prominent criminal gangs were armed robbers that would rob post offices. And they were called the Bass Road Gang. And they were headed by this guy called Johnny DeStark. He was once charged alone, not with the rest of his gang, as having been one of the Brabant Killers. But the case went nowhere and he was finally released. The other instance where there were charges in the Brabant Killer case were about this gang called the Borans, which were more of a group of drinking buddies. And they came from a very poor area of Belgium where there was there was little opportunities. Then you have the second group, which is political or terrorist groups. For example, you had this neo-Nazi group called the Westland New Post. You also had the actual Belgium state secret services that could have been implicated. And then you had all the foreign operators that could have been controlled by a foreign Western intelligence service, for example, like the CIA or NATO or another group. And finally, you had more of a hybrid group. They're called the Buhush Gang. They were, as far as I can see, much more sophisticated than the others, and they included police officers and ex-police officers.
And there's never been any other specific individuals that have been pointed out as possible suspects?
For the purpose of the book, I concentrated mostly on those groups. If you want to go beyond, there's a whole bunch of other groups that exist and that were suspects for some elements of the case. I could state the PIO de Bonvoisin or the CPIC for political groups, and you have other criminal gangs like the Southerners. During my research, I did look at all the groups that were not mentioned in my book individually, and I used the premise that each group had committed the Brabant killings. Then I would try to see how they would have done it, if it fit. In this way, I excluded the ones that were much more far-fetched than the others.
What can you tell me about this Danny Buhush, the supposed ringleader of these suspects who were believed to have been former gendarmes?
I don't want to go too much into details into the inner workings of the Buhush group. For one, they're entitled to the presumption of innocence and they have the right to their private lives. Many of these people are still alive. My book is different from the typical true crime book in that the case is still unsolved. And if there's a similar case, it would be something like Jack the Ripper. But unlike Jack the Ripper, it's not happened 100 years ago or more, where there's no risk of slandering anyone. If the police decide to follow this link and arrest the Buhush gang, we'll figure out who those members are. And I want to say about the Buhush gang that there were criminals gravitating around the Buhush gangs Some were murderers, but they were never invited in the inner circle that committed the Brabant killing. So we can't assume that because one of these people was a criminal and he was in that sphere, that he was necessarily a Brabant killer. And I could add about the Bouhouche gang that it had extensive links with the gendarmerie, which was the elite police force at the time. But just because some gendarmes or police officers had links with the Bouhouche gang, it does not make them necessarily suspect, because some were perfectly innocent.
And was Bouhouche a member of the gendarme throughout the period of the killings?
No, he was only a member of the gendarmerie during half of the first wave of killings. He did some jail time for other crimes, like between the Brabant killings and the late 90s, 2000. And then he died after he had hid from the press in France in a logging accident in 2003.
So it's been 5 years since these killings and no one's been brought to justice. Do you think eventually anyone will be arrested regarding these killings?
I think so. The Belgian government has recently tabled and passed some legislation that allows police officers to flip lower members of a criminal organization. And I think this could be obviously very helpful. In exchange for their testimony, you could give them now a reduced sentence or shield them completely from prosecution.
Thank you, Charles Maurice, the author of a book on the Brabant Killers entitled Insane Killers, Inc.